The way video games, television, and other forms of media are localized from one language into another is something that I've been interested in for quite some time now. So much so that I devoted the last 10 years of my life to learning Japanese. And one of the main things I learned over the last decade is that localization is not an exact science. It's more akin to a form of art. A lot of the time, where you choose to change something and to what degree you change it is at the discretion of the localizer in charge of the product, as well as the company localizing it. However, this freedom to change whatever one feels needs to be changed leads to a large discrepancy in the way much of our media is localized. Some companies and localizers err on the side of caution and choose to remain as close to the original work as possible with their localizations, while others can change a product into something almost unrecognizable from the original. This discrepancy is precisely what I'd like to talk about here today. Specifically, at what point do we reach a level of unnecessary changes and move into over-localization territory? Just a quick disclaimer, this is going to be a very opinionated video. If you disagree with what I'm about to discuss, that's absolutely fine, and I'd love to hear your opinions on localization in the comments below. Thanks, and without further ado, let's get back to the video. First things first, I should probably talk about the difference between translation and localization in case there's anyone out there wondering what it is. To put it into very simple terms, translation is the process of translating one language into another while sticking as close as possible to the source language's content, be it text or spoken word. Localization, on the other hand, is when you adjust your translation of a particular work to better suit the cultural norms and understanding of your audience. Translation is pretty cut and dry in the way it works, but like I said earlier, localization covers a broad range of philosophies and practices, so it's much more complicated to describe. To make things a little bit easier to understand, I've come up with something I like to call the localization spectrum. On the lowest end, we have simple translation, followed by Tier 1 localization, Tier 2 localization, and on the right end, Tier 3 localization. Don't worry, we're going to go through these one by one, and I'll give you some examples of each. First off, translation. I'm sure you've got the definition down by this point, so I won't restate it, but one thing I would like to note is that translation, much like localization, is not an exact science. It's much closer to a science than localization is, but there are times where certain words, phrases, or ideas don't translate exactly into your target language. There are several ways to get around translating such things, like through the use of translator's notes or simply using an approximate translation. Also, contrary to what you might have heard elsewhere, translation does take into account the context of the original work, as well as correct grammar. So the famous "all your base art belong to us" quote from Zero Wing was not a result of direct translation, it's just a bad translation, most likely done by someone whose first language was not English. An example of media that utilizes translation as its main means of bridging the gap between two cultures is modern subtitled anime. Now, there are some examples of anime that I wouldn't consider translation, but for the most part we've seen more of a shift towards very accurate and hands-off translation in recent years. Why is that, you might ask? Well, it has to do with the target audience, in my opinion. As anime has become more widespread and accepted as a legitimate hobby over the years, people have begun to learn more and more about the Japanese language and culture. This means that translators of anime don't really have to worry too much about localizing certain aspects of an anime because they won't be understood or accepted by the fanbase. For example, in Japanese there is something called an honorific. It's a specific word you attach to someone's name that typically shows how you feel about them, as well as the nature of your relationship. That's a very bare-bones definition, but a very in-depth description is not really necessary for the purposes of this video. Honorifics don't translate well into English, but many translators choose to leave them in their translations of anime because the fanbase understands what they mean and wants to hear them. Of course, it's not just honorifics. Many concepts and words that would typically be localized out of a product are left in when adapting anime into English, and that's why I consider it to be much closer to translation than localization. Moving on to Tier 1 localization, this is the simplest form of localization that may even be considered translation by some. When a localizer or company decides to use Tier 1 localization, it means they have decided to stay as close to the original work as possible, only changing those things I mentioned earlier that are untranslatable and can't be understood by a large audience in the target country, like honorifics, idioms, language-specific jokes and puns, so on and so forth. I also consider changes that are required under law to be Tier 1 localization. To sum it up a little bit better, Tier 1 localization is when only things that absolutely must be changed for one reason or another are changed. The biggest example of Tier 1 localization I can think of is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Contrary to what you might think based on Nintendo's history, Breath of the Wild's English localization is extremely close to the original Japanese. I've played the game in both languages, and I can tell you there is some stuff in here that I'm really surprised they left in. For example, the name of Hatuno Village. If you only speak English, it may just sound like a generic town name, but it actually has a much deeper meaning. If you were to take the full name of Hateno Village in Japanese and read it out, it would be Hateno Mura. This literally translates into English as village on the outskirts or faraway village. Based on its location, I think it's a very fitting name, but why wasn't it localized if it's Japanese? Well, since it's a name, it's not actually necessary to translate it. In fact, many locations and characters retain their original names in Breath of the Wild. Since they're names, you just read them and understand that that's what this person or location is called. Would some people have preferred a localized name for Hateno Village? Maybe, but I'm sure that there are others out there that like it this way too. That's what I mean when I say Tier 1 localization is only changes that absolutely must be made. Hateno Village is a fine name that wasn't 100% necessary to change, so they left it in. Now we get into the real meat of this debate, Tier 2 localization. Tier 2 localization is plain and simple the most popular form of localization out there. It's also probably the most complicated, but I'll do my best to describe it for you. Tier 2 localization is when a company or individual localizer makes a conscious decision to change a particular aspect or aspects of a product based on their opinion of what will sell better and or be culturally understood and accepted by the target audience. These changes are often not entirely necessary, but serve to make the product more appealing to a particular country's people, at least in theory. Take Animal Crossing for example. The original Japanese name for Animal Crossing is Doubutsu no Mori, which literally translates to Animal Forest in English. There is not really a particular reason why the name had to be changed from Animal Forest to Animal Crossing, but nevertheless it was changed, most likely because someone at Nintendo of America had the opinion that the name Animal Forest wouldn't appeal as much to an American audience. Were they right? Perhaps, but the point is that this was not a change made out of necessity, but opinion. Another huge example of Tier 2 localization is the Pokemon franchise. Most Pokemon, moves, trainers, towns, and items have had their names changed to better suit a Western audience. Like I mentioned when talking about Breath of the Wild, names don't necessarily need to be changed to be accepted by a different culture. Take Pikachu for example. Even though its name remains unchanged across all regions, it is still one of, if not the most beloved Pokemon of all time. This just goes to show that the names were localized based on opinion. But not all localization is solely language-based. Sometimes it can extend even to visuals. Now, actually changing in-game or in-show visuals is not a very common practice, but when it comes to packaging, that's a whole different story. If you're a Kirby fan, you might know where I'm going with this. As I'm sure many of you are aware, video game box art often differs very greatly by region. This is another form of Tier 2 localization. Picking a package that better appeals to your target audience is basic marketing, but it most definitely is not a necessity, especially when a perfectly good box already exists. One of the more arbitrary choices when it comes to box art is the fact that Kirby appears angry on most Western boxes, but he's all smiles in his country of origin, Japan. While it is rather humorous, this is obviously a very unnecessary change that was based on the opinion that Westerners prefer a tougher version of Kirby, which I don't even think is the case. Moral of the story is that Tier 2 localization is all about opinion, and the changes made are mostly not required in order to understand the product. The final and probably rarest form of localization is Tier 3 localization. This is where a product is completely rebuilt from the ground up to better suit the target audience. This type of localization is most commonly used for things like food. Think American sushi or Japanese McDonald's. They retain the same name as the original, but are extremely different almost to the point of being unrecognizable. This type of localization is very rare in the world of media, but it has been done in the past. The only example I know of is the American Super Mario Bros. 2, which was a completely different game to what was originally released in Japan. The American version was a reskin of the game Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, a completely separate game developed by Nintendo. When Nintendo of America initially playtested the original Super Mario Bros. 2, they found it to be too difficult and too similar to the original game, so it was rejected. This was also a decision largely based on opinion. There was no need to change the game. Nintendo of America just felt that the original wouldn't sell well, so they changed it. I honestly think that the original Super Mario Bros. 2 is a really fun and challenging game that could have been a hit if given a chance, but I guess we'll never know. One thing that I don't really like about this particular type of localization is that it usually leads to confusion at some point. When someone says Super Mario Bros. 2, are they talking about the Lost Levels or the Doki Doki Panic version? If I get sushi in America, does it come with avocado in it? You can never be 100% sure. But okay, now that we've gone through the whole localization spectrum, we can finally talk about the matter at hand. When does localization become over-localization? You might have guessed based on my tone throughout the video, but in my opinion, anything above Tier 1 localization should be considered over-localization. That is, any change made not out of necessity but opinion enters the realm of overlocalization. That's not to say that I don't love and enjoy many overlocalized products. Of course I do, but who's to say I wouldn't like them if they weren't overlocalized? Would you really hate Animal Crossing if it was called Animal Forest? Would changing Huntino Village to Faraway Village make you enjoy the game more? I'd like to think that for most people the answer would be no. So why does Tier 2 localization have such prevalence in the gaming industry? I think it comes from not only an opinion, but a fear that at a basic level, different cultures can't understand one another. Not really something I ever thought I'd be talking about in a video, but here we are. By saying you think changing something about a piece of media that isn't absolutely necessary to change will make it sell better or be better understood, you are at the same time saying that you believe leaving it unchanged will make it sell worse and be less well understood. Looking back to my Pikachu example, we have seen that this is not always the case, and like with Breath of the Wild, that sometimes leaving a piece of media relatively untouched can produce very positive results. Not only does it protect the artistic integrity of the original creators and bring a more accurate representation of the product to consumers, but only localizing what is absolutely necessary can also lead to an opportunity for learning and cultural exchange. I honestly believe that many big media companies that choose to overlocalize their products can learn a lot from the anime industry. I know, but just bear with me on this one. Like I said in the beginning of the video, anime adaptation nowadays typically falls more towards the side of translation. This has led many of those that watch anime to gain a better understanding of and interest in Japanese culture and the Japanese language. What was considered to be untranslatable a few decades back is now being left in the translation like it was always meant to be there in many cases. And I think that if more gaming companies, and just media companies in general, would consider taking a more hands-off approach to localization, we could see similar growth to that of the anime fandom in many other communities. Some companies, like Nintendo, have started to move towards this less aggressive form of localization with their recent releases. Animal Crossing, for example, has done a great job of leaving in much of the region-specific holidays and items, and I think that's really cool. There's still a long way to go, but it's a good start. Do I think there will ever come a time where Tier 2 and Tier 3 localization completely disappear? Absolutely not. It's just too ingrained in the industry at this point. But at the very least, I do hope that we can move towards a future where making countless opinionated changes to pieces of art is no longer considered the norm. Oh boy, that was a different one. Hopefully I didn't bore too many of you guys with all the localization talk. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about, so I really wanted to make a video just focusing on my thoughts about localization. I know that, just like me, there are many others out there that hold opinions on localization that are very important to them. If you're one of those people, that's great, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments, but please be respectful of other people's opinions, just as I have tried to be. As always, thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. You just made my day. If you enjoyed what you saw and heard here today, consider giving the video a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out. Grr, I'm American Kirby, and I'm gonna kick your butt.